So in this video, we're going to be continuing our discussion kind of overall of climate change policy. We're going to have a special section where we talk about economic policy. It actually falls into this category. We spent the last video talking about adaptation policy, some things we can do to make ourselves more resilient to climate change and kind of adapt to a changing climate. I went through a whole list of different things. Mitigation. This is really the realm of how can we prevent climate change in the future? Like what can we change now? What can we change over the kind of near term to lessen the effects of climate change down the road? So you're probably already kind of spinning through a couple of things that might count as mitigation. This is a really big idea, the notion of affecting further climate change. And so if we were to strip everything down and all of our dreams could come true and all of those sorts of things, the first thing that we could do to mitigate future climate change is actually to just get rid of all of the CO2 emissions, which means we stop generating power, we stop agriculture, we stop making concrete, we stop having transportation. Obviously, that's not going to work, right? And actually, even if that were to work, there's still a significant amount of CO2 sitting in the atmosphere. And you guys remember from some previous modules, residence time, right? So even if we were to stop all CO2 emission today, today's a Thursday, so on Thursday we stop, there's going to be some amount of time, really kind of on the decade or maybe like, the 50-year scale where we'll start to see the effects of that. And that's a big problem, right? Some of that we'll actually address on the backside in some of the subsequent videos. So to do this, we have to be realistic, right? We have to think about, okay, where is CO2 coming from? And what can we do to lessen that? And this is an area where we've actually talked a lot before, right? How to reduce CO2. We've talked about it kind of at the big picture scale. We've kind of investigated at the personal scale, right, using our carbon footprint and our lifestyle project. So when we come back to think about all of these different aspects of climate policy, again, adaptation, mitigation, and then we're going to kind of dip into geoengineering, like I said in subsequent videos. What most people agree upon is the notion that this is really the centerpiece, right? This is where the action can happen. So adapting to climate change doesn't really do anything to lessen climate change, right? It doesn't kind of get at the big picture, the underlying problems. So this is pretty straightforward. This is get rid of all the people. Again, not realistic. So, there have been, for other reasons, times in kind of human history where we've tried to do this, right? China had this famous kind of one-child policy where each couple could have one child, and there were penalties if you had more. It didn't really work that well. And, again, once you kind of are really starting to tell people what to do, people kind of revolt. People weren't necessarily happy with the one-child policy. So we can't do that at the scale of the globe. We have kind of, religious and cultural traditions. We've talked a little bit about, population and kind of how you get these changes in demographics. Generally, the more developed the nation is, the less its population grows. And particularly places like Denmark, also Italy, are actually having a negative population trend. Their populations are shrinking. This is, so 2022, the United States population on an annual basis shrank for the first time in a very long time, right? Our deaths outweighed our births. And then there were larger things, right? So generally we have a lot of immigration that kind of bumps those numbers up so that we're not in a negative trend. But with COVID restrictions, we've had some pretty strict regulations on immigration that limit that. And so we saw, like I said, a negative population trend for the first time in a while. But we're never going to get to the point where that's going to make an impact on climate. We consume things, right? That's one of the things that we do, right? We like stuff. Not only kind of our food and our basic necessities, but our stereos and our all of our things, right? And so those take energy to produce. So limiting consumption of goods, well, again, we got to write it on the board and it could make sense, but it's not realistic, right? So when we think about consumption, consumption is another word for what we call economic growth, right? Or economic activity, right? We're out engaging, we're buying things. And if we have increased consumption, another way that you could say that if you were a politician in a business suit is you could say this is economic growth. And that's going to get you reelected. So again, from that point of view, if we were to stop economic growth and say, none of these companies are going to be allowed to develop and kind of grow and create new products that are going to make people want to come out and get them, that doesn't really work in our financial system, right? So again, it's not necessarily possible. Another aspect that comes up when we talk about consumption is that, again, we're in a developed nation and we consume things, right? We've all got phones in our pockets. Mine's not in my pocket. Mine's over here. But that's not true for everyone. So you guys are kind of familiar with the notion that there are many people on Earth, 2 billion people that get by on the equivalent of a couple of dollars per day. And one of the things that we're seeing is we're seeing significant economic growth in those areas. And actually Africa in particular, Africa is kind of in the process of modernizing. And largely, when demographers, people who study demographics and population, when they talk about what the future holds, really a lot of them kind of coalesce on the notion that that's the African century, right? We're going to see the African continent kind of come into its own, and they want stuff too. When you think about the notion of developing nations, that's a significant increase in consumption that I think most people would agree is a good thing, right? We don't want, at the level of like the United Nations, we don't want 2 billion people living on a couple of dollars a day. We want everyone to be happy and comfortable worldwide. So you can see reducing population, that's not going to happen. Limiting consumption, not really going to happen. So one thing that can help is increasing technology. So one of the things that we're going to kind of dip into a little bit going forward is the notion of things like carbon capture and sequestration. It's a little bit of a boogeyman, just kind of big picture. There's actually quite a few problems with it, but that doesn't mean that it's not viable going forward. Thinking about existing power plants, well, actually many of them could probably tune up the equipment and kind of, modify a few things to reduce CO2 output. We've talked about other technological advances, even simple ones, right? Like modernizing irrigation. We looked at putting solar panels over irrigation canals. So there's kind of technology that can solve that. And then the last one that I want to talk about kind of in the category of mitigation is the notion of governments, right? So governments have control over what's allowed within their boundaries, and they can control, what their power portfolio looks like. So when you look at some kind of big international meetings, like the Paris Climate Agreement, there's been quite a few other, climate summits. One of the things that people come away with is that the government can do this. And some of the things that we're going to examine in the future in subsequent videos, again, are policies such as a carbon tax. Or there's really kind of two philosophies in doing this, right? And interestingly enough, they kind of fall along political lines, which we'll, again, touch on that a bit later. But you could think about making regulations, saying these things are outlawed, or you can do it with a financial structure. You can say, great, make all the carbon you want. Here's how much you're going to have to pay for how much carbon you're producing. And so then the owners could say, great, let's make less carbon, we'll pay less. There's also a cap and trade system, an auctioning of kind of carbon credits. Again, kind of carbon capture and sequestration kind of falls into that realm. So there's a lot that can be done here really by kind of government intervention in the realm of mitigation. We can say, We want to be, we want all of our power to be, coal-free by some date in the future. Actually, if you look at Idaho Power, I believe Idaho Power says coal-free by 2050. That's pretty far out there. One of the things that you could also think about is, even though it's not very impactful, we've set mileage requirements for new vehicles. So, a new, a 2027 Ford Fiesta, I think they still make those, you will have to get, 50 miles to the gallon or something like that. And those have actually kind of gotten swirled up with, again, technology. And what we're starting to see is, rather than trying to create these like ultra efficient engines that run on petroleum, it actually just makes more sense to switch to either hybrid or EV, like electric vehicle technology. And, we've got the electric Hummer is coming out soon. The electric Jeep Wrangler is coming out soon. And again, there's some kind of government incentive behind that. So the last thing that I want to touch on, and we're gonna do a video about this, is when we think about what is the goal of mitigation. So sure, we want less carbon. That's the goal. But how much? Like what is less? And so there's a group we call the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, which is essentially scientists from over 200 countries getting together, kind of doing their best work. They've set essentially targets, or what we call tipping point temperatures. One of the things you'll see is there's actually a lot of moving parts here. So the numbers you see are about 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. That's kind of our general amount of heat that we can probably deal with, right? That's a small amount of climate change over the next little while. Going beyond that potentially triggers irreparable harm to the climate, or just fundamental changes on the surface of the earth, things that are not able to be repaired, not able to be adjusted. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about climate targets and tipping points that are essentially goals of mitigation, right? And again, we try to set this goal of, limiting ourselves to 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. But that then also has carbon associated with it, right? What's the amount of carbon that's associated with that level of warming, and how much carbon are we putting out right now? All right, well, I'll go ahead and catch you in that video.